I think I'm on. Yes, I'm getting the word. Yes, the director says I'm on. Hello and welcome to the March 2021 online meeting. It's actually April. It was an April Fool's joke. The April online meeting of Sydney Skeptics in the Pub. My name is Richard Saunders. I'm from the Australian Skeptics. I'm an investigator for the Australian Skeptics and a life member. Before we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting tonight. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, don't forget, you can subscribe to the Skeptic magazine, which I think there's the latest one there over my shoulder, just by going to www.skeptics.com.au. Find out all sorts of things about the Australian Skeptics, of course. And most back issues, going back almost 40 years, are free online for you to download and read at your leisure. You'll be pleased to hear we are still working hard to get back to a real Skeptics in the Pub. Keep your eye on the information for that. Maybe next month we can all be together again in Sydney Skeptics in the Pub. We have to keep that a little bit open at the moment, as I'm sure you can well understand. And speaking about April the 1st, I'm here to tell you that, yes, UFOs do exist, and Uri Geller did bend spoons. Well, of course, unidentified flying objects. There's one probably right now. And yes, Uri Geller did bend spoons, but then so can anybody if you know how to do it. Let's start with the fun we have at Sydney Skeptics in the Pub when we actually meet together. We do spoon bending lessons and all sorts of things. Anyway, tonight we present Jennie Brand-Miller, Professor of Human Nutrition at the University of Sydney. Carbohydrates, the good, the bad, and the whole grain. They include starches, sugars, high GI, low GI, and the whole versus refined grains. Do they really contribute to weight gain, diabetes, and other afflictions? Jennie will help sort out the scientific evidence from the nonsense, something she does every day of the week. Professor Jennie Brand-Miller is a past president of the Nutrition Society of Australia and past chair of the National Committee for Nutrition of the Australian Academy of Science and president of the Glycemic Index Foundation Limited, a not-for-profit health promotion charity that administers a food symbol program for consumers. Now, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of our guest a bit later on, and you can do that, type it in via the link that should be appearing on the Twitch page you're watching at the moment, that will take you to Slido, the system we use for questions. And if you haven't done so already, please click the follow button so you will be notified whenever we go live. And we'll be doing that more and more, I suspect. But now, please join me in welcoming Professor Jennie Brand-Miller.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you for the invitation. You and Jessica, thank you. I feel very honoured to be here.
Well, it's our pleasure, an absolute pleasure to host you. We've been having all sorts of interesting people since this craziness began. Normally, of course, you'd be our guest at Skeptics in the pub for real, where we would buy you a dinner. I promise you that. Teach you how to bend a spoon, and you would talk in front of our guests, our regular pub attendees. But I'm sure that's all coming up in the future. But tonight we're going to be talking about carbohydrates, and I, for one, know precious little about carbohydrates. I know that it's got a couple of syllables in the word and it begins with a C. But honestly, like many people, I suspect, I don't know terribly much about them. So let's start with the obvious questions. What are they, and what's so special about them?
Okay, so carbohydrates are one of the components in food. There are three main components. You've probably heard of proteins and fats. And the other big component is carbohydrate. And under carbohydrate, we include the sugars that are in food, the ones in fruit, the ones in soft drinks, and includes the starches that are in things like bread and rice and pasta. And of course, it also includes fiber, the stuff that goes all the way through the gut to the large bowel and encourages the growth of bacteria in our gut, which is a good thing on the whole.
Right. So it's a little bit more complicated than I thought. They're not just a simple little category of things. I see. And is there a minimum requirement for carbohydrates in the diet? Should we be measuring them or going out to get special food with extra or less?
Well, surprisingly, we don't know whether there's an absolute minimum, believe it or not. The experiments that have been done have actually had to be abandoned or aborted because it's very hard to actually eat a diet that's got no carbohydrate at all. And we kind of, I think our brain needs carbohydrate. And if we can't make enough in our body, I think things start to go a little strange in the brain. And if we happen to be pregnant, we know that perhaps we'll have trouble carrying that baby all the way to delivery, and perhaps we'll have trouble with lactation as well. So the message is, I think there should be a minimum amount of carbohydrate in the diet, but we haven't got the evidence to set it at the moment.
Is it a case of the old standby? You usually do quite well if you eat a well-rounded, balanced diet with variety.
Oh, I think so. I kind of like that message. Eat everything in moderation. And I include under the moderation, I include chocolate and I include alcohol. I think it's a really actually important message. When we say that you shouldn't eat too much of something, it doesn't mean that you should avoid it completely.
Right.
And many people take that message. They think when people say, oh, limit sugars or limit alcohol or limit something, that the healthiest thing is to avoid them. But that's actually not true in nutrition, because as you say, if you eat a little bit of everything, you're more likely to get everything you need.
Yes. Yeah, it's an old standby, isn't it? It's an oldie but a goodie. And a lot of people, especially in these modern times, can eat very strange diets, sadly lacking in a lot of nutrition, I think.
I think that's true. So the fewer foods you eat, the more likely you are to end up with either a deficiency or a toxicity, because if you are getting a lot of something, you're more likely to reach the levels that are associated with harm. And you might be missing something you really need, because the human diet has a lot of micronutrients that we need.
Yeah.
And so geographically, it's actually a good idea to have foods coming from everywhere, because the foods that are grown locally might actually have a deficit in something. And that's particularly true in many parts of Australia, because our soils are fairly poor soils everywhere, not because we've damaged them, but simply because our continent is a very old continent that hasn't had a lot of, thermal like volcanoes and things for a long time. So most of the nutrients in our soils have been washed off into the ocean eons ago. So Australia really needs to focus on some micronutrients that are really important, particularly iodine.
That's interesting. I never thought about that before. I had this idea that the farming lands in Australia were lush and had everything needed. But you make a very good point. And talking about going back eons and eons and generations, what do you think our DNA can tell us about diet during human evolution from that point of view?
This is really interesting. A fascinating subject, full stop, is human evolution. But what we can see are kind of marks in the DNA that tell us that in the long ago past, there was some positive selection going on. And one of the most obvious is for the gene that digests the sugar in milk, which is called lactose.
Right.
And the enzyme that is made by that gene is called lactase. And long time ago, maybe 15,000 years ago, when human beings started to do things like dairying, there was a positive selection going on for the people that could digest the lactose in milk after the age of weaning.
Yeah.
So say after the age of 5, the people that had high levels of the enzyme that digests lactose actually became more and more common. There was some kind of positive selection going on. So today, Northern European people and all their offspring around the world generally have high levels of lactase during adulthood, but the vast majority of human beings don't. So the lactose in milk can cause them some unfortunate symptoms like diarrhea. So that mark is in the genes. And interestingly, it's a carbohydrate. And then there's another mark in the genes, which is a gene called AMY1, which produces the amylase enzyme in saliva. And this enzyme starts the process of starch digestion. And starches are one of the carbohydrates in food. So there was something, again, that was positive about these carbohydrates, and it's selected for people that had more copies of the gene. And so today there are people that might have only 2 copies, and there are people that might have 20 copies.
Wow.
And the average is about 6 to 8 copies. Their differences are again around the world. And the interesting thing is that if you have more copies, it seems that you might be less likely to have obesity and overweight. So it's interesting. We don't know exactly what's happening, but the people with high copy numbers seem to prefer starchy foods. They seem more, they seem to have a greater state of fullness after eating starch. So maybe, that there's a message in there that we should personalize nutrition. Perhaps there are people who should eat more starch and people who should eat less.
Interesting. Yeah, a complicated issue indeed to try and untangle all of that. I knew that there were many people on the earth that were lactose intolerant to one degree or another, but I didn't understand exactly how many, because when, you know, in our society, growing up with things like milkshakes, going down and getting a milkshake or whatever it is, or having milk with your coffee, milk on your cereal, it was ubiquitous. Especially when I was growing up in a dairy farming area, milk was.
That's right. Yes.
Just give it another thought. But I mean, you know, the intake of carbohydrates generally, is there such a thing as too much? Is too much of a good thing in that case?
Good question, because not long ago, maybe 3 years ago, there was a paper in one of the major medical journals which suggested that people who ate a lot of carbohydrate, you know, levels where something like 70% of their energy in their diet came from carbohydrates. This research suggested that they were not likely to live as long, that they have a higher all-cause mortality for, you know, any reason. And that paper, of course, it caused quite a stir, the idea that you could have too much carbohydrate. But in the end, there was a lot of criticism that suggested that the people that were eating a lot of carbohydrate foods like rice and bread, that they perhaps were living with less income, that they were more likely to have problems getting enough food and having clean water and everything else, so that it was impossible to kind of tease out the causes of the higher mortality. But last month, another paper came out from the same cohort of people showing that actually it was high glycemic index carbohydrates that were associated with higher mortality. That the lower glycemic index carbohydrates were fine, and they actually favored longer life.
Things I never knew. So why is the level of blood glucose so important then?
Well, first things we should say, Richard, is that this is what the glycemic index is all about. It's a way of you know, rating carbohydrates according to how much effect they have on blood glucose. So blood glucose and glycemia mean the same thing. So when we eat a carbohydrate-containing food or meal, then our blood glucose goes up and down within the space of about an hour. Right. The higher it goes, the more harm it does. So people with diabetes who have some kind of dysfunction in the metabolism of carbohydrate, their blood glucose is more likely to go too high. But there's such a thing as too little, and your blood glucose level should not fall too low, because that's associated with symptoms that are quite unpleasant. And if people with type 1 diabetes who've taken too much insulin can actually go into a coma, and they can die from low blood glucose levels. So the message again is having something there in between. And what the glycemic index does is help you to choose the carbohydrates that are likely to have a moderate effect on your blood glucose rather than too high.
Right. But how does a high blood sugar cause harm? What is it doing to you exactly? Well,
when glucose is in the bloodstream, there are some tissues which detect the rise in blood glucose, things like our muscles, and they open up their gates to this glucose and allow the glucose to enter the cells. But there are also tissues which just equilibrate to the level of glucose in the blood. So if it becomes too high, the cells, these particular cells, will also have levels that are too high. And the one is the red cells. One is the eyes, the kidneys, the cells that line the blood vessels are all very susceptible to glucose that's too high. And what happens is all the proteins that are in our cells, when they're exposed to glucose, they become what we call glycosylated. basically at the molecular level, the glucose has become stuck to the protein. And then that protein no longer does what it should do. It becomes dysfunctional. So the protein starts to break down, and you no longer have the enzymes you need. You no longer have the cellular structure that you need. And this is the reason why people who have uncontrolled or badly controlled diabetes will suffer eventually from complications like blindness and kidney failure and heart disease. So keeping blood glucose levels within a even keel is the way we want to go.
Yeah, and you've reminded me that especially, I guess, in the last 20 years, I've certainly heard the term diabetes more and more and more. Not only in our society here in Australia, but sadly, particularly in the United States, you hear this a lot.
That's right. So yes, so diabetes, type 2 diabetes,
yes,
which is the form that's associated, which is the most common. 9 out of 10 people with diabetes have type 2. And it is becoming more common, more prevalent. It's if you have a family history, if you have a mum and dad who've had type 2 diabetes, you're more likely to have it as well. So it's strongly inherited. It's strongly associated with your weight. But even if you maintain a good weight, if your family history is very strong, then you can get diabetes too.
Right. And is there a relationship between, say, simple sugars in the diet and high blood glucose?
Well, everyone thinks there is. The first thing people think when you hear someone has diabetes is, oh, they must have eaten too much sugar.
Yeah.
But about 40 years ago, there was a paper published by a group of people in Canada, which actually blew that idea out of the water. They were the first to actually look at feeding real foods to real people and comparing foods with each other. And what they found was, surprisingly, that the foods that contain high amounts of sugars, ice cream, Mars bars, the table sugar, they actually had a sort of moderate effect on blood glucose. On a scale from 0 to 100, they were in the 60s. And foods like bread and rice and potatoes, they, on this scale of 0 to 100, they were 70 and 80 and even 90.
Oh, okay.
This was the first paper on the glycemic index of foods. It was the paper that really tickled my imagination. Up to that time, I thought blood glucose and people who complained about low blood glucose were imagining it. But this first research showed that, yes, foods did have an effect. Some made the blood glucose go so high that the body's response was to pump out a lot of insulin and bring the glucose down very rapidly, so that it actually went past the baseline. So it came down so fast that it undershot the baseline. And that means that temporarily those people could have a low blood sugar. So I started to look at, from this time I thought we should be looking at Aboriginal bush foods. We should see what hunter-gatherers ate. Did they have high glycemic index foods or low glycemic index foods? And really the field became more and more popular. And today we know the glycemic index of thousands and thousands of foods.
Right. Wow, that's fascinating. And what about fiber and blood glucose? Because we're always told eat more fiber, eat more fiber.
Okay, so yes, and fiber is a carbohydrate, and that one of the assumptions is that a food that's high in fiber will have a low glycemic index. the assumption is that the fibre will in some way slow things down. But again, the research blew this idea out of the water. So what they found, there was no difference in the glycemic index of white bread and wholemeal bread. There was no real difference between brown rice and white rice. There were some fibrous foods like beans, legumes, lentils, chickpeas. They have a form of fibre that's called viscous fibre, and that does slow down digestion of starches. It does lower the glycemic index of foods, but the vast majority of whole grain foods have a high GI. So whole grains that we might see on a packet of breakfast cereal, might have a lot of fibre. It might be made with whole grains, but chances are it's a high glycemic index food.
Okay, something to look out for. But, I mean, glycemic index, and I've heard this for years now. GI. What's the scale? What do the numbers mean?
All right. So, if we want to work out the glycemic index of food, we take 10 people. We ask them to come to our laboratory without breakfast in the fasting state. We feed them, on one occasion, we feed them a glucose load, glucose sugar, 50 grams, and we follow their blood sugar levels as they rise and fall over the next 2 hours. And then we send them away with breakfast. We do that again. We even do it 3 times so that we have a good handle on that person's what we call glucose tolerance. Then when we come to testing a real food, say white bread, we feed the same amount of carbohydrate, 50 grams. It'll be 5 slices of white bread, the identical amounts of carbohydrate. And again, we measure their blood sugars over the next 2 hours. And then what we do is simply express the average blood sugar to the bread as a ratio, as a percentage of that same individual's response to the glucose sugar. So we've done it in 10 people. We take the average. We could do it in more people, but the science says 10's enough to get a good average. And that's what the glycemic index of the food will be. So in Australia and many other countries, food companies ask us to test the glycemic index of foods. So we have a team of volunteers who come in to our laboratory every morning of the week and test foods for us. So the food industry, sometimes they decide that they will advertise that their food is low glycemic index. And if I'm allowed to say it, probably the best example is some of the breads that are such as Bergen breads, some of the breads that are sold in Coles supermarkets. You will see the low GI symbol as a kind of signpost to say, this is not only a low glycemic index food, this is a nutritious food, which is a source of slowly digested carbohydrates.
Okay, something to keep an eye on. I like the idea of a food tester. I've been many things in my life, but I think a food tester is something I should aim for. Let's have a look at some of the other questions. All right, let's pick this one up. What about legumes, beans? Are they all low GI?
Generally, yes, that's correct. I call legumes and beans the superfoods. They are the foods that people who call themselves vegans or vegetarians, they depend on legumes as a good source of protein, but they're also an excellent source of slowly digested carbs. So even if they've been canned, like baked beans or chickpeas, that canning process is not having a marked effect on their glycemic index. They're still low GI. They have been shown to be able to make you feel fuller for longer. So if you had a grandma like mine, you would have heard the expression "stick to your ribs." Some foods
Yes.
stick to your ribs. Yes.
Yes.
And that these actually happened to be the foods that, at least in my grandma's day, were the foods that were very slowly digested. So things like porridge, oats that have been produced with traditional methods will have a low GI. But if they've been made instant oats, basically they become high GI foods in the process of making them instant. So what allows them to be cooked quickly is also the same thing that allows them to be digested quickly, starting with salivary amylase. So you can't guess, even I can't guess, the glycemic index of an unknown food. I'm always being surprised by some of the results that we have. So one example are the products that are milkshakes that are used as total milk replacements. Sorry, right. Total meal replacements. Those milkshakes, they are in a packet, and people use them very effectively for weight loss. Well, they are 50% carbohydrates, and most of those carbohydrates are sugars, but they have a low glycemic index, and they allow you to lose weight very quickly.
Yeah, I haven't used that myself, but I've known people who've gone on those shakes, and there can be a dramatic weight loss following that. Whether that's long-term or not is a different story, but I've seen that in action. But talking about added sugars, they've been, and this is something the skeptics know too well, they've been sort of demonized in certain quarters. Why do you think that is, and do they really cause the weight gain?
Yes, a big question, Richard. I'm glad to hear that it's something that you're the skeptics are skeptical of. So you hear so much about sugars being bad for you. There's certainly in the last 10 years, there's the pure, white and deadly expression when it comes to sugar. But in my opinion, this message is overdone. It's overwrought. It's exaggerated. I think the scientific evidence tells us that a moderate amount of sugars in the diet is commensurate with good health, and certainly commensurate with enjoyment of food. And I like to think that some sugars, like say you have a piece of toast for breakfast or a snack, preferably it's whole grain bread that's got a low GI. But if you want to put marmalade on it, if you want to put honey on it, go ahead, because that increases your enjoyment of that food. And to me, that means that enjoyment of the food means that it's actually pressed all the right buttons in the brain. The enjoyment corresponds to a satisfaction that means that you're less likely to overeat something else.
All right. Yes. Stick to 1 or 2 slices of toast. That doesn't mean 6 or 7 with the marmalade or the honey. And what is this thing I've heard about called the Australian paradox?
Okay, so the Australian paradox I chose with my co-author Alan Barclay as the name of a paper that I published about 2011. I called it the Australian paradox because this paper brought together evidence that sugar intake in Australia had been decreasing over the past 50 years. It was a surprise to many people because everybody thought sugar was the reason we were getting fat and we must be eating more and more. But the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and the World Health Organization had been collecting statistics on sugar intake around the world, and the data from Australia showed this steady decline. So I called it the Australian paradox because I was aware of the French paradox. And the French paradox is the observation that French people who eat lots of dairy foods and chocolate and cheeses and red wine. They actually are some of the slimmest people on the planet. They don't have a high rate of cardiovascular disease compared to many other European countries. So this was called the French paradox, and I thought, well, we'll call this the Australian paradox. But a lot of people got their knickers in a knot. They did not like me giving this data in the form I did. They thought that I was exaggerating, that the FAO, WHO could not be trusted, that it was not accounting for imported foods. But eventually the Australian Bureau of Statistics came to my aid. They actually published the difference in sugar intakes between two national dietary surveys, and they confirmed that added sugars in the Australian diet had been declining. So it's true. Even though we've tripled the prevalence of overweight and obesity in the last 30 years, sugar intake has been declining during that process.
That's interesting. Now, everybody, thank you so much for your questions. They're just pouring into our question area at the moment. We'll get to those in a minute. A few more questions, however, for you, Jennie. Is fructose more harmful than glucose?
Well, this question has been a topic of research now for about 10 to 20 years. And at first, people thought fructose, which happens to be a component of the sugar in added sugars as well, they thought fructose was particularly dangerous, particularly likely to cause a rise in blood lipids like triglycerides, more likely to cause fatty liver, which is something that many people develop if they're overweight, fatty liver. But more and more the research is saying, well, this is true only when you eat very large amounts of fructose. You really have to eat more than 90% of the highest level that's consumed by the average person. So above the 95th percentile, if you like, very large amounts of fructose will do that. And what's particularly interesting to have learned is that what the human body does is in the cells lining the gut, any fructose is actually converted to glucose before it hits the bloodstream. So it's actually unlikely that the liver is exposed to large amounts of fructose. So that early evidence was mostly based on animal work and not on human work. And I think the question of fructose toxicity has basically died.
Oh, interesting. All right. Yes, some more questions coming in. We'll get to those in 1 minute. But let's say, given all this research, why are we still arguing about the optimal diet for health? I mean, don't we know by now?
You think so. But, you know, nutrition science is a relatively young science. Compared to physics, compared to biology and other areas of science, nutrition science is young. And, you know, we spent many decades working out what caused a deficiency, what toxicity was, and we looked at protein quality, we looked at the proteins in plant foods versus animal foods, and then we went on to fats, and we looked at saturated fat and unsaturated fat. And it's only lately that we've got onto carbohydrates, the third component of food. And so we're still learning. Unlike a drug, it's impossible to do a blind study in nutrition. People know what they're eating, and they have ideas in their brain about what might do harm and what might do good. So it's very difficult to do what's called a randomized controlled trial, where both the investigator and the participant are blinded to what's going on. So we have all these subjective ideas, and those sorts of studies where we feed a diet for a long period of time, they're horrendously expensive to do a study like that. You start with $1 million and you go up to do a randomized controlled trial of one diet versus another, in which the composition of the food is guaranteed by providing all the food to the subjects. And, you know, we're trying to do a study like that at the moment, and it's a $2 million study. And you wonder whether that's the way the taxpayer wants to spend the money or not. But obesity is a huge problem. Most people think nutrition and diet have got a lot to do with it. We need to solve the problem of obesity and diabetes. So far, we've been saying the same thing for perhaps 50 years. We've been telling people to eat less and move more, but that advice is next to useless. It doesn't work. And me as a nutritionist, and reading the literature every day that I do, I've come to the conclusion that actually the brain has got more to do with obesity. The genes, the epigenetics, the effects of stress and sleep are probably more important than the effects of the food itself.
Wow, that's interesting. Now, everybody, if you experience a few little dropouts here, there's a little bit of an internet lag. I hope that you're all still with me. My computer was just telling me that there was some congestion or something on the line, but I think we're all happy now. So finally, before we get to some questions from the audience, any take-home messages for everybody out there?
Take-home lessons, okay. It probably sounds a bit twee, but I think whatever you choose to eat, I hope you enjoy it. I hope it presses all the right buttons in the brain, because that's what life is about. It's dopamine hits in the brain, and for many people that comes from food, particularly for people that can't afford other kinds of hits. So for some of us, the hit comes from shopping, the hit comes from exercise, running and jogging. It's important to get several dopamine hits a day. So enjoy the food. I would say my best advice is my advice is to choose choose a diet that includes the foods that are slowly digested and absorbed. So they're low glycemic index foods, and they include things like pasta. They doesn't need to be brown pasta, it can be white pasta. Enjoy beans, things like the Indian dals and the baked beans and simple foods like that are slowly digested and absorbed. So are the majority of fruits and vegetables. So are the majority of dairy foods. So I still think there is something in the saturated fat story. So, eat dairy foods in moderation, particularly things like cheeses. But yogurt is something that keeps coming up as associated with long life. And it happens to be a low glycemic index food, even if it's sweetened. So I think I've covered them. Eat small amounts of red meat, fish, poultry, pork, if that's what you like, in moderation. You don't have to avoid anything. I think that's it. Of course, get some exercise, because the more exercise you get, the more chocolate you get to eat.
I think your message is eat, drink, and be merry at the end of all that. I know I get my special dopamine hit from peanuts. There's just something about peanuts, I can't tell you. All right, so everybody, you've been very patient. We have a few questions coming in. I don't know if I can get to all your questions, but we'll see what we can do. Somebody is asking, keto diets seem very popular, even among highly educated people. Is this a reasonable diet? If not, is there anything you would say to make people think twice?
So sorry, Richard, say it again, please.
Keto diets. The question is about keto diets.
Keto
Hey,
diets.
keto
Okay.
diets. They seem very popular. What's your opinion on those?
Okay. So a keto diet, for those who are not aware, is a diet that tries to have no carbohydrate in it or very little carbohydrate. And what this does to metabolism is it starts the burning of more and more fat. And as you burn fat, ketones rise. And ketones can make you feel very full and satiated. So, in fact, they can keep you actually, after a few days of maybe headaches and feeling hungry, a keto diet will be associated with a feeling of fullness, to the extent which starving people find it quite easy to be starving. But my feeling is that this type of diet is not for everyone. It sounds like something you'd enjoy. It means no fruit or very little fruit. It means no pasta, no bread, no rice, no potatoes. If that sounds something that you'd like, you'd want to avoid all those foods, then give it a try. Make sure that you're getting lean proteins and good quality fats, because there are a lot of calories that are displaced by carbohydrate. But to be honest, I think for people who are pregnant and lactating, and that's includes the people that might fall pregnant, and that's a lot of people, that's a high proportion of the population, I think a keto diet is something that might be associated with harm. So we should be careful, we should be cautious. To me, to give up those foods is not something I would do lightly. I would do it if I had persuasive evidence that it was good for my health.
Right.
But not otherwise, yeah.
Another question that's come in. There is a lot of talk in the last couple of years. There has been a lot of talk in the last couple of years that fat has been incorrectly blamed for modern diet health issues. Is this true as claimed? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yes, I have an opinion. I think to some extent, yes, the fat story has been overwrought as well. I think it's a shame that we've demonized fat, just like we've demonized carbohydrates. I think it's a shame, because people know that some of the best science is behind the benefits of the Mediterranean diet. And the Mediterranean diet is one which is high in fat, but the fat comes from some good sources. It includes olive oil, and it includes the fats, the long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids that you find in some foods. So there's not one thing that makes the Mediterranean diet beneficial. It's a mixture of things. So you can't take just the fat story out of it and leave the rest behind.
Right.
You need to take the whole diet, the whole Mediterranean diet into account. So yes, I think also that dairy fat has been given a very black image. It's probably not as black. There's more shades of grey, I guess. That I'd say dairy fat now, where we stand, it could be said to be neutral. It's not harmful. It's not terribly beneficial. But if you like the dairy fats, the ones you find in yogurt in particular, then there could be a good excuse for having that yogurt every day, because it provides such a good package of overall nutrients. It's not just about the fat, it's about the protein and the calcium and everything else. So yes, the fat story's been overdone. The message, just like carbohydrate, is be choosy about the kind of fat. Be choosy about the kind of carbohydrates.
All right. Here's an interesting one. Somebody has said, I heard once that ice cream and peanut M&Ms, where's the question, are low GI. Does this mean they are a healthy diet?
No, no. Just like if I said to you that an orange is a healthy diet. Well, I mean, oranges are a healthy food, but if you based your whole diet on oranges, it would be a very unhealthy diet. It would not be balanced. So the same applies to low GI foods. That's why the symbol that the GI Foundation uses is a signpost, not just to low GI. It's a signpost to a nutritious food, a nutritious source of slowly digested carbohydrates.
All right, a couple more questions, folks, because time is catching up with us. Somebody has asked here, is 90-second microwavable rice, whether it's white, brown, etc., really that bad for you?
I don't think it's bad for you. I use it myself. I use it myself. Funnily enough, to have a rice that is you can put in a foil bag and microwave requires it to have a texture which is not like cement. It must not glug up and form a brick. So it just happens that the varieties of rice that go into those bags have often got a low GI because they've got to keep, they can't use a sticky rice. They have to use a rice which is more, the grains are more separated, and that happens to correspond to, more likely than not, to a slowly digested rice. So, I mean, you can eat more, you will get more micronutrients from the brown version, but to actually be an advantage to the diet overall, you'd have to eat a lot of rice for the choice to be brown rice over white rice. So again, my message is if rice is something you eat now and again, go ahead and choose the rice that you enjoy most, which is probably white.
In my case, it's the brown. I do prefer, just for taste-wise, when I put my 90-second microwavable rice in the microwave, it's usually the brown one. But that's okay. I mean,
that's great. That's good.
And I think we've got time for one more question. Let me have a little look here. What is the best way I can manage my carbohydrate intake with regards to product packaging at my local store? What are the red flags I need to look out for?
Chances are, if it's instant, if it's quick cooking, if it's, but again, it's not a guarantee. I would choose the foods that are in a packet that are labeled low GI, and some of them are now. I would watch for the symbol, the low GI symbol. Some companies have their own low GI symbols, but really, unless the GI is on the label, you can't guess. You can, and now I have to say I've got a conflict of interest. There's a little pocket book called The Shopper's Guide to Low GI Foods. There's also a searchable GI database on our website. The University of Sydney's Glycemic Index website has a searchable GI database with thousands of foods. You can have that on your phone if you like. But I really would like to see the information that you have in the nutrition panel. I think that should include the GI. So the next set of dietary guidelines, I hope, will be actually recommending that whole grains are low GI. So if it says it's whole grain, it should be low GI as well.
All right. Well, there's something to look out for. I think also the print size on those nutritional information on every package should be twice as big, because
Yeah, I know. I've actually got a lens in my kitchen drawer in order to look at the typeface on most packaged foods. I think it's an insult to people to put such small print. Actually, it doesn't take into account that there are many people out there with vision impairments. Just like it's about diversity and inclusion. We need to include the people that come along with us. We need to be able to tap into our switch thing. So the George's Institute produces a food switch app, which tells us, you type in the name of the food and it gives us then the best version of that food. It gives you the best brand of that food. So that's a useful app to have on your phone.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I mean, I try to read these things, but what's worse is when I bring the microwave rice home and I can't even read the instructions on the packet because the type is so small. But that's a discussion for another time, I'd imagine. Folks, I hope you can join me in a big vote of thanks to Professor Jennie Brand-Miller for a fascinating talk tonight about something which I knew precious little, and I certainly know a little bit more about the subject now. So, Professor Jennie Brand-Miller, thank you again, and hopefully we can see you in person some stage this year for some carbohydrates and spoon bending lessons at Skeptics in the Pub. Thank you, Richard. I would really like to do that sometime in the future. Thank you. Thank you to all our listeners, to our audience. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you. And so for everybody else, yes, we'll keep you updated soon. I hope we can tell you about our future plans. We'll be here probably regardless, so you can enjoy talks, but we might be doing them live from the pub, or you can come and join us at the pub. Keep your eye on skeptics.com.au and the meetup for other details. But for this evening, until our next Skeptics in the Pub, this is Richard Saunders, the host of the Skeptic Zone podcast, of course, and committee member of the Australian Skeptics here in Sydney. Don't forget skeptics.com.au for all your skeptical needs. But for tonight, good night.